So hello and welcome to Windows in Time, the Jews of Pioneer Jacksonville, presented by Jackson County Library Services and Southern Oregon Historical Society. I'm Carrie Tannehill, Interim Branch Manager. This program is being recorded. As I mentioned before, please mute your microphone and turn off your camera if you don't want to be included in the recording. The recording of today's program will be uploaded to the JCLS Beyond YouTube channel within 2 weeks. At the end, we'll have a question and answer time. So if you have questions as they come up, feel free to put them in the chat box and we will, Carolyn will answer them at the end. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Jackson County Library Services. So if you were listening to what I said earlier, the title is a little different than what we advertised. During the second half of the 19th century, German would have been the second language you heard on the streets of Jacksonville. Fortune seekers that had come for the gold that was discovered in the winter of 1851-52, and settlers also came for the promise of free land. But the individuals who actually prospered were the merchants who supplied the miners and settlers with the good they had to leave behind. So the majority of these merchants were German-speaking Jews who were first-generation European immigrants. So instead of the broad brush presentation that Carolyn originally planned, she's going to be focusing on these Jewish merchants, how they helped turn Jacksonville into the commercial, governmental, and social hub of Southern Oregon in the 1800s. So thank you for being with us today, Carolyn, and I'm going to go ahead and give the presentation over to you.
All right, thank you. And let's see if I can share my screen. Well, as Carrie said, I had originally planned on the German settlers of Jacksonville, German-speaking settlers, but that brush got a bit broad. And as she also said, when we had the fortune seekers coming for the gold, along with all of their hangers-on, we had the settlers coming for the free land, but the ones who really amassed the money or the wealth were the merchants. And most of these merchants were German-speaking, and most of them were Jewish. In fact, from the discovery of gold in the winter of 1851-52 until the coming of the railroad in the 1880s, almost all of the Jewish residents were merchant families. And most of the Jewish residents were also first-generation European immigrants. So let's talk about how that came to be. In 1848, there were major events unfolding on opposite sides of the world. There were multiple failed revolutions in Europe, in France, in Germany, and Russia, but particularly in the German states. And previously, as the citizens tried to wrest additional civil rights from the monarchs, they had gotten accustomed to more latitude, to more civil rights, but then that got clamped down on. And particularly, it was particularly hard on minorities like the Jews. And so they had had a bit of a taste of freedom. And they wanted to be somewhere where their life, what they could do, where they could live, was not conditioned upon their religious faith. So at that point, we had a large migration of European Jews, particularly from Germany, to the United States, where they thought they would, they could have civil rights, enjoy freedoms without being penalized for their religious beliefs. And then, of course, the second event that year, 1848, was the discovery of gold in California that set off a rush of fortune seekers from around the world, along with the individuals who made their own livings off of the fortune seekers. But as gold played out in the Sacramento Valley, miners began working their way north. They were always looking for the next great find. And then gold was discovered in Southern Oregon, in the Jacksonville area. Now, contrary to this marker, this was not where gold was found. Gold was found not too far away from here, but this was not the actual site. And contrary to the popular stories, it was not discovered by two packers named James Cluggage and James Poole. The most credible story is that it was actually discovered by the son of Alonzo Skinner, who was the Indian agent, along with one of his hired hands, a Mr. Sykes. Well, as it happened, Cluckage and Poole were carrying goods from Portland down to Wairika, and they spent the night with Sykes. With Skinner. And there they heard about the discovery of gold. And so the next morning, the next day, when they continued their trip, there are again several different versions. Either they thought they had tried their hand at panning a little gold, or they stopped to water their mules, or a mule stepped on a gold nugget. But either way, they found color in the water, gold. Poole had been an experienced miner, so he was the one who recognized it. But what they did next was, I find, really interesting. They headed on down to Wairika, and they filed donation land claims for what became essentially the main part, essentially all of downtown Jacksonville, Table Rock City, but then later Jacksonville. But what they did next was even stranger. Well, Poole went back to mining, but Cluckage publicized their find, and the publicity sent over 1,000 miners over the Siskiyou Mountains into southern Oregon, into the area that would become Jacksonville. And as I said, Poole continued to mine, but Cluckage found his gold selling land. Well, the mining boom didn't last that long, but Jackson County also offered rich agricultural land. And under a government donation land claim, it could be free for those who didn't mind hard work. And the amount that you could claim depended on when you arrived. Prior to those arriving by 1850, prior to 1850, you could claim 320 acres if you were single and 640 if you were married. After 1853, it was changed to 160 acres if you were single and 320 if you were married. There was a second donation land claim offering. But so soon farms replaced the mines as a source of the economic security. But with miners and settlers creating a community, they were in desperate need of almost everything because they had to leave it behind. So the merchants were close behind, and the majority of them were Jewish. They found a ready market for their businesses. So just who was the first Jew in Southern Oregon? The answer is we don't know. The first records we really have are the 1852 Pioneer Census, which shows 7. We had John Bruner at age 31. He was also known as Jacob, but probably more commonly known as Jacob. His younger brother, Herman. There was Solomon Cohen, J.J. Friedman, S. Jacobs, Bernard Levy, and Joseph Newmark. And that question of 18 is whether his age was 18 or 48. We can't brag on the handwriting of the census takers. But it's also that there were others, because there was a lot of German immigration. Biblical names were popular. So there were quite a few other names of individuals who may also have been German. Names like Abram, Greenberg, Rosenstock, Ettlinger, Abrahams, Cohenstein, Friedlander, Levenger, Weisberg, and Goldsmith. Basically, the Jewish merchants dominated the market. More came: dry goods dealers, grocers, suppliers of mining equipment, merchants, clerks, bookkeepers. They dominated the market. So some of the earlies, Jacob Bruner and his brother, they were probably the first long-term Jewish merchants. They had arrived by 1852. And Bruner was very successful. He established himself as a merchant carrying one of the heaviest stock of goods by 1853 anyway, or late 1852. And by 1854, he had purchased the entire block of South Oregon Street between Maine and California. And he built his first store at the prime intersection of Maine and South Oregon. The original building was wood, but by 1855, he had replaced it with a fireproof brick store. So also in business, that's by 1854, were Abe and Newman Fisher. And the Bruners and the Fishers were the first merchants to advertise in the Table Rock Sentinel. So again, they're advertising goods that the miners and settlers would need. Other prominent Jewish merchants included Max Mueller, Simon Cairo, Lippmann Coleman, Morris Mincer, Israel Haynes, Solomon Sachs, Sam Goldstein, David Levenger, Herman Bloom, J. Rowe, Bernard Levy, Solomon Cohn, Elias Jacobs, A. Marks, Jimmy Drum, Morris Baum, and more came. So what was life like for them? Well, these are some of the things we're going to take a look at. First of all, the barter and credit economy they had to deal with, blue laws, their ability to amass wealth, family, religious observance, assimilation, which was giving as well as taking, politics and political involvement, and of course, discrimination. At the time, they were living in a barter and credit economy, basically. There was paper money in circulation issued by federal governments, state governments. There were various coins circulating as well. But the only thing the merchants really trusted were gold and Mexican silver. But even then, people didn't have them. So until the crops were harvested or the mine paid off, individuals and families relied on a trade and credit to obtain needed services and supplies. I can't tell you how many merchants were paid in chickens, grain, or various vegetables. But the merchants still had to pay their suppliers in order to bring in the fresh merchandise. So before each buying trip or before a new stock of goods arrived, they would be publishing ads, asking people, or demanding actually, that people pay up their outstanding accounts. The first published ad that we have still exists. It was in the January 5th issue of the Table Rock Sentinel. It was published by Jacob Bruner and read, "Notice, it is hereby given the accounts due to our firm must be settled by the 31st of this month. Otherwise, they will be placed in the hands of the sheriff for collection." So lawsuits were common whenever a merchant had difficulty collecting the money that owed him. And Gustav Karuski may have set the record for filing lawsuits. He filed 32 lawsuits in the span of 9 years. They were also common when the wholesaler, would sue the merchant when the merchants had not paid for the goods himself. And some merchants would deliberately collect their complete supply of goods, and then they would leave town, never paying for them. So they would, taking as much merchandise as possible with them. In fact, in the early 1850s, Abe Fisher postponed paying a packer who had brought in his goods, Pete Schutz, for the merchandise that he had bought, anticipating that since it was the Rogue Indian Wars, that there was a good chance that Schutz might be killed by one of the Indians, and so he wouldn't have to pay. Well, Fisher made the mistake of telling a mutual friend this, and Schutz found out and took it out of Fisher's hide. So we will say that Fisher settled his account. But another thing they were dealing with were the blue laws. In 1855, the territorial legislature decided to enforce an act they had passed the previous year. It was called the Act to Prevent the Sabbath Breaking, and it provided for a fine against anyone found guilty of keeping his secular business open other than works of necessity or mercy on the Lord's Day or Sunday. So in 1855, an M. Levy was indicted for keeping his store open on Sunday. Same in 1860, Herman Bloom was charged with keeping his store open on Sunday. Given the early records, we have no idea of the disposition of these cases. In 1860, Max Mueller was charged with having his saloon open on Sunday, but he was found not guilty. And in 1863, Louis Levy was charged with selling liquor on Sunday. He requested a jury trial. The jury found him not guilty. We can only assume that those handling Mueller's and Levy's cases liked their alcohol. But the initial fine was $5. It was later raised anywhere to between $10 and $25. We do not know how many people actually had to pay it. As with the barter and credit economy, almost all of the merchants' assets were tied up in their inventory. At the same time, they were still the wealthiest group in Southern Oregon. I'm not going to read through all of these issues, these names and amounts with you, but you can see here that like in personal property, Mueller had almost $26,000 in 1869. Others had real property ranging from 10 to 30,000, and that's in addition to their real estate. Now, a lot of this was their inventory, and it could fluctuate. You could see a change in terms of thousands of dollars from one year to the next, as monies were collected or monies were outstanding, as new goods came in or as goods were sold. So there could be great variability from one year to the next, but the merchants were still the wealthiest group. And family. Most of Jacksonville's Jewish families were interrelated. In fact, not just the Jewish families, but settlers in general, if they were successful, they would encourage family members to join them. And then they would bring their grown children into their businesses or hire them to work on their farms or have them work, where they could also prosper. Probably the Fishers and the Mincers had the most extended relationships that we're aware of. You can see here we had the three siblings, Abe Fisher, his brother Newman Fisher, and then their sister Matilda. Well, Newman brought his wife's parents, Eliza Jacobs, Newman's father-in-law, was here. And then Jacobs brought his brother-in-law, A. Marks. Well, Matilda Fisher married Morris Mincer. And Morris, his sister Adeline, married Lipman Coleman. So as you can see, we have all of these interconnections among the families. I like a description I just read the other day. It was not really a family tree, it was a family orchard. And of course, among these families, there were many births, deaths, and marriages. The three Fisher siblings had 29 children among them. And this was a time of epidemics. We had smallpox, cholera, diphtheria, typhoid going through, and they particularly decimated the younger populations. Well, the Jacksonville Cemetery, according to Jewish law, it has its own Jewish section. It currently has 13 graves remaining in it. We think that there were probably many more, but later people were disinterred and buried elsewhere as families moved on. But of the 13 graves, 6 belonged to children under the age of 4, and 2 of those were the children of Abe and Newman Fisher. The grave you sit at, the headstone, the marker you see here, you can see it has Hebrew inscription. It's for the daughter of Newman and Rachel Fisher. And with the Hebrew inscription, it probably means that they sent down to San Francisco for it, and that it was carved there and then delivered and placed on her grave. As to marriages, no Jewish marriages within the place took place in Jacksonville. Most of them that we're aware of took place in San Francisco. We know of one that took place in Portland, but basically there was no one here to perform the ceremony. And although there were Jewish marriages outside of the faith who did take place in Jacksonville. But in terms of marriages, like one of the families, the Sachs brothers, 6 of the Sachs brothers lived here at one time. but only one of them ever brought a family member to Jacksonville. Lippman Sachs brought his wife for a short period of time. The others, they kept their families, they left their families in San Francisco. So it was a real mix in terms of who truly settled here, I guess you might say. And I said that the reason the ceremonies, the marriages were not performed, we do not find any record of there being a rabbi in Jacksonville. Now, for other ceremonies, any Jewish individual who had Hebrew training and education could conduct the religious services. And while there may not have been regular services on Friday evening or Saturdays, the Jewish Sabbath, we do know that they always did observe the high holy days. There were regular notices in the Oregon Sentinel and the Democratic Times for Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. They were always observed. And we would find that while the Jews might keep their stores open on regular Saturdays, never on those high holy days. And in fact, there would be reports in the newspaper of the merchants, if they were out of town buying goods, returning home in time to observe the high holy days. Probably the one who conducted most of the services was Elias Jacobs. He was Newman Fisher's father-in-law, and he did have the Hebrew training. So he probably closed his store and acted as a rabbi. Frequency of the other services is not known, but most services could be conducted with a minyan of 10 Jewish males over age 13. So a minyan could almost be formed for liturgical purposes, like if they needed to have prayer services or Jewish funerals. So in terms of assimilation, as noted, the Sachs brothers didn't bring their families, but others brought their families and had their children here. So some of the Jewish residents, I noted, they married outside of their faith, either converting to Christianity or following no religious tradition. But something to note is that all of the first generation Jewish residents were European born. By 1870, 2/3 had become naturalized citizens. Something else to think of in terms of assimilation that probably made it a lot more straightforward is they were all white. And most of them, virtually all, German was their first language. And if you recall in the introduction, Carrie noted that probably at the time, 1/3 of Jacksonville's population was German speaking. But they also, they loved their community and they gave as well as took. So we noticed that they closed their businesses to celebrate the 4th of July, but then they also joined the planning committees for them. When the community remodeled the Methodist Church, Max Mueller and the Fisher brothers, they contributed needed materials. Jewish residents regularly registered for the military rolls and served as jurors. Jacob Brunner helped organize the Hook and Ladder Company, which was the first fire company in Jacksonville. Mueller and Solomon Sachs constructed stone crosswalks in town. And one winter when the snowfall had been so heavy, Mueller and Sachs also paid for the city workers to dig out the sidewalks. It made sense. I mean, that way the people could get to their stores. They were also, though, heavily involved in the fraternal organizations. Most of them joined various lodges. Some were officers. I think this is probably because they had not been allowed to do this in their homelands. And so they wanted to be as much as they could and do as much as they could to celebrate their freedom to do so. Both male and female, but here were the lodges, the primary lodges. We had the Ancient Free and Accepted Masons, Warren Lodge number 10. Jacob Solomon served as the first junior deacon when the lodge was chartered in 1855. Herman Bloom was Royal Arch Captain and in 1861 recording secretary. Lippmann Sachs was secretary of the Royal Archbasins that same year, and Max Mueller was secretary of the Warren Lodge for 32 years, also recording secretary of the Improved Order of Redmen. So speaking of the Improved Order of Redmen, it combined with the Independent Order and the Haymakers to build what we know as Redmen's Hall, and they often met together as United Order of Redmen. So I should explain the name Redmen. I know it doesn't sound terribly politically correct these days. The name came from, well, they considered themselves descended from the Sons of Liberty, who staged the Boston Tea Party dressed as Native Americans. And so that's where the name Redmen came from. So Elias Jacobs, although he's shown in his Oddfellows regalia here, he was Oberchief of the United Order of Redmen from 1877 to 79. And at various times in the Improved Order, Isaac Sachs was Chief of Records, and Solomon Sachs, Benjamin Sachs, and Simon Cairo were secretary. In the International Order of Oddfellows, in 1872, Newman Fisher was Noble Grand, and Isaac Sachs recording secretary. Sachs was a trustee of the lodge in 1875, and his brother Solomon, Noble Grand, a year later. And as the Ancient Order of United Workmen, Banner Lodge number 23, the Jewish community was less involved with this group, but Max Mueller was a financial backer of the order. So one thing, the women were also members of the female auxiliaries, the Eastern Star, the Rebeccas, the Degree of Pocahontas, and for example, Rachel Fisher, who was Newman Fisher's wife, was the recording secretary of the Oddfellows Ruth Rebecca Lodge from 1877 to 1879. So something to note is the large number of Jewish members who held the position of recording secretaries. And that is a real testament to the high level of literacy among the Jewish community. Politics and political involvement. Well, not only were they involved in the fraternal orders, they were involved in politics because this was a chance. They had not had the chance in their homelands. So here they could exercise their civil rights. And they did so with great gusto, I will say. They were involved in city and county government from the time of Jacksonville's incorporation. Lippmann Sachs was clerk at the city's organizational election in 1860. Jacob Brunner was one of the first elected trustees. There was a Jewish city trustee for all but 2 of the next 15 years. Newman Fisher was county treasurer. Max Mueller was a trustee president, which was the equivalent of mayor, city treasurer, Jacksonville postmaster, county treasurer, and county clerk. I think Mueller outdid them all. I should note here that the picture of Old City Hall was not where these individuals served. That building was built in 1880, and the historic Jackson County Courthouse, which is now Jacksonville's new City Hall, was built in 1883. So where these meetings were met, where they served, it was typically, it could have been a meeting room among one of the lodges. It could have been in one of the churches. It was often one of the saloons. For a while, that was in the old 2-story Masonic Hall, wooden hall, before it became too dilapidated to meet there. So it was also, and their offices, like for the treasurers, that was usually the building where their business was, just for the record. So discrimination. Jews were seldom singled out collectively or individually for their religious faith, and some thought Jewish was a nationality. As I've already noted, they were white and they were German-speaking, which was so many other members of the population. Although Lippmann Coleman was often referred to as Jew Coleman, apparently to distinguish him from a Christian named Coleman, and Max Mueller was remembered as a good old Jew. But politics could be a different matter. Given the number of offices he ran for and held, Max Mueller was a favorite target. So some of the quotes that you would hear in the paper, the Republican candidate is a member of the tribe of Levi. It is not Max Mueller's fault that he is an Israelite, but it is certainly not creditable in him. But Jewish politicians could also be discriminatory. Israel Haynes introduced a bill in the state legislature to impose a $5 tax on every Negro, Chinaman, Kanaka, and mulatto residing in Oregon for the use of the county where they resided. The penalty for non-payment was arrest and forced labor. The bill did not pass. So who were some of these early Jewish residents? Well, we've already mentioned Jacob Brunner. And a 31-year-old Jacob Brunner was one of the earliest Jewish merchants to arrive in Jacksonville. He's in the 1852 census along with that of his younger brother Herman. By 1853, Jacob and a partner, Henry Goldsmith, had purchased the entire Oregon Street block, I told you, from Maine to California Street. And it was part of the original donation land claim of Cluggage, and they purchased it from Cluggage. So they built their store on the corner lot, which is a prime location. And they must have originally operated out of a wooden structure, but then by 1855, they had their brick structure. Because September 1854, brick manufacturers Horace and Abel Reed sold J.A. Brunner and Company 60,000 good bricks suitable for building. And by January 1856, Brunner and Brother were advertising their fireproof brick store at the corner of Main and Oregon Street, boasting the largest and best assorted stock of goods, selected particularly to meet the wants of the farmers, mechanics, and miners of this country. So despite the rogue Indian Wars, Jacksonville did prosper during this period. In 1857, Brunner and Brother advertised staple and fancy dry goods, clothing, boots and shoes, hardware, queensware, glassware, groceries, paints and oils, together with a large assortment of jewelry consisting of gold watches, breast pins, finger rings, gold and silver pencil cases, and pens to be sold at San Francisco prices plus freight. 1860 appears to have been a banner year for Brunner. He became one of Jacksonville's first elected trustees that year. In April of that year, he also bought out Goldsmith's interest in the property. And he then added a brick extension to the building, the rear of the building, and reportedly making it the largest store building in Jackson County and the largest south of Salem. And in December 1860, he also sold John Drake the north end of his lot, along with the right to attach a brick building to the north wall of his store. The building that was eventually attached there was the Orth building, and many of you may be familiar with that. However, by 1862, let me go back. By 1862, Brunner had sold his stock of merchandise to Max Mueller, and a year later, he deeded the Brunner building back to his former partner, Goldsmith. So Brunner apparently belatedly caught gold fever and moved on to the mines of southern Idaho. But by 1864, he was living in San Francisco. Since then, the Brunner building has undergone many reincarnations, but it still remains the town's and Oregon's oldest brick building still standing. Now we'll move to the Haynes brothers. Israel Haynes was actually born in Xenia, Ohio in 1827. He came to Oregon at the age of 19 with Colonel Loring's regiment of mounted rifles. They were formed to protect the Oregon Territory. He arrived in Jacksonville no later than 1854 and was soon joined by his brother Robert. Prior to 1856, they were operating Haynes Boot and Shoe Store out of a one-story wood frame building at the southwest corner of California and Oregon, another prime location. This again was part of Bruner's original lot. And by 1861, they had constructed this one-story Haynes fire and were advertising Haynes and Brothers Fireproof Brick Store and Variety Store in Haynes Brothers Brick Building. The construction expenses may have overextended the brothers financially because by 1862, Israel was reading law and Robert was studying medicine. In 1864, Israel was elected to the state legislature and shortly afterwards was admitted to the bar in Salem. Robert relocated to San Francisco. Israel moved to Eastern Oregon, where he became a prominent Baker City attorney and politician. And when the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1884, he donated 120 acres of his 1,200-acre farmland for a town site, founding the town of Haynes. Another merchant was Simon Caroy. As you can see, this was a prime intersection. We don't know where the Caroy brothers' original store was located. We think probably in the McCulley building, but they were the next to occupy this corner site. And in 1866, Isidore Caroy had invited his younger brother, Simon, to join him. And a 16-year-old Simon came to Jacksonville directly from Hamburg, Germany. So while in Jacksonville, Simon learned Chinese so he could deal with the 800 miners in Jackson County. And this corner location became known as Caroy's Corner, even though the brothers moved to Ashland in 1870 and becoming one of the early merchants in that city. However, it appears that Simon retained business interests. He apparently had a partnership with the Fisher brothers because we find pay-up ads showing a Fisher and Caroy partnership. And a 20-year-old Simon was already being shown as having $500 in real estate and $3,000 in personal property in the 1870 census. Subsequent censuses actually show Simon as head of household. So we're guessing that he was the one with the real merchant smarts, if you will. By 1880, the Caroy brothers had moved to Douglas County. They may have well been associated. There was a Jewish community there, known as the Jewish colony of New Odessa, near Roseburg, and so they may have been associated with it. But apparently, Simon retained some of his business interest here in Jacksonville, and Simon, in general, was such a successful merchant that he was able to travel back to Germany every other year to visit his mother until his mother's death. So that speaks to both his devotion to his mother and his wealth to be able to do so. We've mentioned the Fisher brothers several times. Abraham had arrived in Jacksonville by 1853, and his brother Newman joined him shortly thereafterwards. They were one of the first to advertise in the Table Rock Sentinel, as we mentioned earlier. Their initial store was also located in the McCulley building, which was the first two-story brick building in Jacksonville, built in 1861. It later became Oddfellows Hall. But by 1860, Abraham, and this is Abe, I'm sorry, that's my finger, that's Abe. He had built a home at the intersection of First and Main Streets. And there was also apparently had constructed a warehouse nearby. So they were doing quite well. In 1862, they established a branch store in Josephine County. And they also relocated to this brick building at the northeast corner of California and Oregon streets. Actually, it was not this brick building. It was a brick building. How about that? That location was another prime location. It was the original site of Kenny and Appler's 1852 tent. They were the first store in what was to become Jacksonville. And however, what happened, as I said, this was not their first brick building. Fires consumed their fireproof stores in both 1868 and 1874. And in that latter conflagration, they lost $28,000, but they still rebuilt. So following the 1874 fire, Abe went into partnership with Simon Cairo, and it became A. Fisher and Brother. But until 1877, 1878, when Fisher and Cairo did liquidate and sell out, and Abe Fisher went back to San Francisco, although he did retain interest in some other properties in town and ownership of various pieces of property. Newman Fisher went out on his own. He relocated his business across California Street, and he remained in Jacksonville until about 1890. Newman was also more active in local politics. He had earlier in 1863, he had been appointed postmaster of the Dardanelles post office, and the Dardanelles was actually the first official post office in Jackson County. It's near. It's actually adjacent to Gold Hill, what's known as the Dardanelles. In 1879 and 1886, Newman served as county treasurer. But by 1891, the Fisher brothers had disposed of all of their assets here, and Newman also moved back to San Francisco. But the 1874 Fisher brothers rebuilt store, I should say, still stands today, as so does the McCulley building, and does the building that across California, the street that Newman occupied. So 6 of the Simon brothers, Solomon, Lippman, David, Benjamin, and Isaac, they were all at one time or another in charge of their Jacksonville store, but only Lippman brought his wife here for a while. Most of them, their family members remained in San Francisco, which was their West Coast headquarters, although a brother and sister did stay in Germany. And when the Sachs brothers built their brick Temple of Fashion in 1861, they were a part of a family enterprise that stretched around the world. They were the first store in town devoted to the ladies' furnishings, millinery, and notions. And their opening was accorded much fanfare, and they became a favorite shopping place for the women of the valley. Despite rumors of the contrary, they were not the Sachs family that operated Saks Fifth Avenue. So fire, as we mentioned, you've heard that fire was a major hazard in Jacksonville. For 10 years, they were also agents for Pacific Insurance Company, which was the only legalized insurance company in Oregon at the time. So I should note that fire insurance was an impetus for most of the brick buildings in Jacksonville. It was not a city council ordinance, as some thought, but it was because if you were in a wooden building or if you were adjacent to a wooden building, your fire insurance rates went through the roof. So the Sachs brothers, they may have anticipated Jacksonville's economic eclipse. In 1875, they announced their intention to sell out with as much fanfare as they accompanied their opening 14 years earlier. So interestingly enough, that was the same year that Solomon Sachs was elected a town trustee. But anyway, in 1876, the last of their goods were sold by auction. So why did they leave? Well, some were mining camp followers. So as the miners moved on, so did they. Some did not successfully make the transition from supplying the miners to supplying the farmers. So again, that was problematical. Some of it was financial. As we said, it was a credit and barter economy. So those who could not collect their money or could not survive that way, they also left. Floods and fires were an issue. There were regular fires every few years that took out major sections of town. and floods for both Daisy Creek and Jackson Creek, which were prime mining areas. The waters, they could flood a lot of the buildings, again, wiping out merchandise. In fact, all of the buildings in what was Brunner's Block, where the Orth building is now, all of those buildings have the Daisy Creek runs underneath them, and they all have sump pumps to keep their basements dry. But probably the biggest factor was the coming of the railroad. Because in 1887, the Oregon and California Railroad completed the line over the Siskiyou Summit, making through rail service available from Portland to San Francisco. And merchants sitting on large inventories only saw the ease with which other merchants could order a better quality of goods at a cheaper shipping price than the stock they had on hand. But they failed to realize their own potential for expanding their market and customer base. So most of the town's remaining Jewish merchants at that time moved on to Medford or San Francisco, New York, some other cosmopolitan areas. But 3 stayed. And who stayed, or actually I should say who lived out their lives in Jacksonville. I see we're getting close to the end of their time, so I'm going to be a little fast with this. One was Morris Minzer. He was well known as an enterprising businessman in early Jacksonville. He was a native of Prussia. He left home at age 19, became a laborer in an oil factory in Hamburg, Germany. Within 6 months, he was a clerk, a year later foreman, supervising 1,200 men. He accumulated a few $1,000s, returned home, and gave the money to his parents to care for his younger siblings. He sailed for America a year or so later. He could barely pay his passage, but on board ship, he earned over $600 as an amateur musician. When he got to New York, he sent the money back to his parents. In New York, he worked as a glazier and painter for a few years. Then in 1854, at age 42, married 16-year-old Matilda Fisher. So a year later, they came to San Francisco and then joined her brothers in Jacksonville, where Morris became a co-partner with the Fisher brothers. Within a few years, he went out on his own, first opening a store in Phoenix, but then he returned to Jacksonville and opened Morris Minzer's New York store in the old Brunner building. So given Morris's 16 children, he had no lack of clerical help. His son Isaac was particularly helpful when it came to marketing. He would work in the store during the week, but Sundays was Isaac's day for advertising. He was noted for his Sunday afternoon strolls around town, dressed in the best style of the day with high white collar and the latest model hat and jauntily swinging his cane. The other Minzer sons were equally popular. While Isaac was winning customers for the business, the other 8 sons were winning ball games. And it was said that if your team did not have a Minzer on it to start with, you were not going to win. So Morris operated his New York General Store until 1872, when it became Minzer Brothers, operated by his sons. But he appears to have taken the business back in 1886, when he advertised a closing and fire sale. He remained in Jacksonville until his death in 1887, one of a handful that did remain. Another was Gustav Karuski. He was born in Prussia, and he was part of the Jewish exodus from Central Europe in the mid-1800s. Shortly after his arrival in New Orleans, he heard tales of gold discovery in California, joined the fortune seekers heading west. And so when Sacramento Valley Gold Gate was beginning to give out, he followed them to Southern Oregon as well. But like many others, he soon found that mining for gold or panning for gold could be cold, hard, wet work. So he acquired a string of pack animals and freighted merchandise from Jacksonville over to the miners in Sterlingville. And later he brought in merchandise from Wairika when he could acquire goods at a lower price. In 1854, he opened a general store in what was Sterlingville. So he was able to make a double profit on the freight cost and the markups. In fact, he cleared $20,000 his first year. But in 1860, he did move to Jacksonville, joining a group of Jewish merchants there that he met in the local synagogue, where they were holding their meetings. They helped him get a start, and by 1869, he had acquired enough capital to open his own store. That same year, he also married the widowed Johanna Levy. Her husband, Bernard, had been a close friend, and Johanna had appointed Karuski as the executor of his estate. So friendship led to marriage, and the couple had no children, although Johanna had 4 daughters from her marriage to Levy. So for years, Karuski rented the Brenner Building, again, very popular corner at South Oregon and Maine, and even built a huge stone warehouse in back to hold his merchandise. He dealt primarily in groceries, dry goods, and general merchandise. But as the mining gave out and it turned to an agricultural economy, he began specializing in large farm machinery, becoming the only dealer in heavy equipment in the area. In fact, at one point, Karuski's agricultural implements store took up the entire Jacksonville block between 7th and 8th and D and E streets. In 1881, he also purchased a 3-story grist mill, and within 4 years, it was the 3rd most productive flour mill in the state. In 83, he sold all of his agricultural implements at auction, but continued operating his Rogue River steam flouring mill up until his death. Even in the 1880s, he continued speculating in Jacksonville real estate, even with the town on the decline. But every such sign of confidence in the town was noted by the press and lauded as indicating the town's new boom. Karuski died in Jacksonville in 1890. Johanna outlived him by 13 years. Max Mueller, he was 15 years old when he came to the U.S. from Bavaria in 1851. Although he came alone, he probably had connections to the German community here, and he spent the next 4 years basically learning merchandising skills and learning English. But then, like others before him, he came west because of the gold. He arrived in Jacksonville at 1855 at the age of 19, where he found employment with the local merchants. He then, when he had enough money, he bought a saloon in Ashland, but then moved back to Jacksonville. I'm not going to try to outline all of his accomplishments. We've gone through all of his fraternal orders, all of his political positions that he held. He was probably one of the most outstanding citizens in Jacksonville. He married Louisa Hess, who was also a native of Germany. They had 7 children. 2 of them died in infancy. Louisa was not Jewish. The children were not raised in the Jewish faith. It's not known if Mueller converted to Christianity, but in the headstone that marks their graves, their joint grave in the Masonic section, it reads, "Asleep in Jesus." Mueller died in 1902 following a paralytic stroke shortly after winning the race for Jackson County Treasurer for the 4th time. But at the time of his death, I doubt if Mueller thought of himself as either German or Jewish. I think he thought of himself as American. And in fact, one writer has said that if the famous painting, The Spirit of 76, was reinterpreted as the spirit of pioneer Jacksonville, then Cornelius Beekman would be the central figure, Peter Britt would be the other man playing the drum, and Max Mueller would be the one playing the piccolo. So we only have a handful left at the turn of the century. They were Johanna Levy Karuski, the wife of Bernard Levy, and then later Gustav Karuski. When she died in 1903, there were not enough Jewish residents to bury her. Judge H.K. Hanna delivered the funeral oration, and Beekman was one of the pallbearers. When her daughter, Stella Levy, died, it was the last Jewish burial in Jacksonville Cemetery. Stella had never married. When she passed away in 1936, she was 75 years old. There were no Jewish residents remaining to give her a Jewish funeral. She was buried by her Order of the Eastern Star chapter. She had been a member for over 50 years. So when there were not enough Jewish residents to conduct these funerals, they were buried by their friends and fellow citizens. I sort of like to view these burials as community tributes to the Jewish pioneers who had preceded them, individuals who helped turn Jacksonville into the commercial, governmental, and social hub of Southern Oregon in the second half of the 19th century. Thank you. And here are a few references for your information if you're interested.